Good morning, good evening. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy wherever you are. Welcome to the Voices of Sustainability virtual fireside chat series of the Zayed Sustainability Prize. I'm Andy Revkin. I direct an initiative on communication and sustainability at Columbia University's Climate School. I'm also a longtime journalist. I was at the New York Times for 21 years in different capacities. I've written about climate change since the 1980s, so literally half my life. I'm here today to help to facilitate this conversation. The Zayed Sustainability Prize was established in 2008 as the United Arab Emirates Pioneering Global Award for recognizing organizations and global high schools for their sustainable, innovative, and humanitarian solutions. Today, the prize counts 14 years of global impact, with 370 million people around the world benefiting from its winners' solutions across the categories of health, food, energy, water, and global high schools. Before I go on to set the scene for today's episode, I'd like first to introduce our guest speakers. Dr. Barbara Buchner is the Global Managing Director of the Climate Policy Initiative, named one of the 20 most influential women in climate change and one of the 100 most influential people in climate policy. Barbara advises leaders on climate, energy, and land use investments around the world. Professor Youba Sokona brings over 40 years of experience addressing energy, environment, and sustainable development in Africa, has been at the heart of numerous national and continental initiatives. He is currently a vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change after serving as co-chair of IPCC Working Group 3, before which he served as lead author since 1990. Having been on the beat since those days, I know how hard this work has been, and you deserve a special Medal of Honor for having done so much hard work through all this time. We're having this conversation as the 77th session of the UN General Assembly is taking place. The UN General Assembly is one of the world's largest diplomatic gatherings, providing a unique forum for multilateral discussion of the full spectrum of international issues covered by the Charter of the United Nations. This year, the climate crisis is at the top of the Assembly's agenda. As it should be, climate change is, by many measures, the biggest threat to humanity. More frequent and severe climate extreme events are negatively impacting ecosystems, people, cities, and infrastructure. The sweltering heat waves that recently swept through parts of Europe, Southeast Asia, and America, the floods in Pakistan are the latest example of the devastating impact that climate change can have in a vulnerable landscape that we've built around the world. The evidence that human activity is contributing to these destructive impacts or making them more likely is unequivocal. Governments and businesses around the world are seeking ways to respond to the climate crisis. Responding to climate change involves two possible approaches: reducing the levels of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, that's what's called mitigation, and adapting to the climate change already in the pipeline. This is adaptation, cutting vulnerability on the ground where it exists right now. Let's unpack these two critically important approaches. Barbara, climate change is affecting economies as countries respond to droughts and floods, changes in agricultural and livestock production, sea level rise and storm surge, wildfires and ecosystem changes, as well as health impacts related to heat stress, disease, extreme weather events, and poor air quality. That's quite a menu. How can mitigation and adaptation measures support countries most impacted by climate change and advance their economic goals?
Yes, well, thanks so much, first of all, for having me here. And yes, this is a great question. And our organization, Climate Policy Initiative, recently did some research on this very topic. And what we see is that every dollar invested in mainstreaming climate resilience in new development, either transportation or energy, water, or other key infrastructure, can yield more than 4 times that investment in avoided losses and in other benefits. And there are literally trillions of dollars in investment opportunities in the emerging economies most impacted by climate change. So investing in carbon neutral and resilient infrastructure supports economic development in a way that is sustainable, that is resilient and equitable. And there are sustainable investment opportunities in every sector, from renewable energy to sustainable agriculture, to water and wastewater management, forestry and biodiversity protection, but also public transportation and industrial decarbonization. So what needs to happen? Well, I think everyone has a role in making this happen. Governments can move more quickly to create the policies that are needed to support these transitions and the investment opportunities, as well as move away from damaging policies like fossil fuel subsidies, which to this day still exceed public support for renewable energy. But also private and development finance needs to mainstream climate investment rapidly, building capacity to due diligence, to syndicate and fund all the opportunities that already exist, as well as also support the local markets to expand these pipelines. So that's in a nutshell a very initial answer to your question.
Yeah, and it's a tough go because so far countries have not really lived up to even their existing pledges, let alone ramping them up. Lots of work to do there. Youba, yeah, Youba in the IPCC sixth assessment report, which I wrote about recently and was published, titled Climate Change Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability. It explains that ecosystems are changing rapidly across the globe, which has cascading impacts across people's livelihoods and societies that depend on the services these ecosystems provide. These impacts are becoming increasingly complex and challenging to manage. So what are some of the most pressing challenges faced by communities when it comes to climate preparedness? And what are some effective adaptation strategies outlined in the report that can help preserve ecosystems and reduce communities' vulnerability at the same time to climate change?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, good evening, and I'm happy to be part of this very important conversation. Let me start by arguing that adapting successfully requires an analysis of risks and caused by climate, and the implementation of measures in time and then to reduce these risks. And as one can get from the report, awareness of climate risk and action to reduce them is critical, it's crucial. And we have seen some increase globally, but progress is uneven, and our report highlights large gaps between adaptation action taken and what is needed in many regions, particularly in the poor region, the poor community, and the poor countries. And they are facing a number of problems, and without giving order of priority, one of the fundamental aspects is the poverty and inequality. And then we see that in some part of the world, inequality is in rise. And in addition to that, political commitment is very important at various levels, and then from the local to the national to the regional, the global level. And this is crucial, fundamental, and without that, it's very difficult. And then the institutional capacities, because one of the major issue problem of many of the poor country or poor communities is the institutional capacity, lack of capacity of different institutions that need to support them and then to operate. And then for that, there is a problem of information, of data, and reliability of information. And this is crucial because how to move from a reactive and spontaneous try to react to a much more planned. And you require a number of infrastructure, including a continuous information and continued institutional strengthening. And then for all of that, I think even if the report emphasizes the sense of urgency, and this is something that is a bit lacking. And then in addition to all, funding is very important, critical. And the report indicate also that clearly nature offers a lot of untapped potential. This is not only to reduce climate risk and deal with the causes of climate change, but it also improves people's lives. For instance, by restoring and safeguarding ecosystems on land and in the ocean, we help plants and animals to build climate resilience. And nature, in turn, can help us to regulate climate and then give us clean, safe water, control pests and disease, and pollinate our crops. However, we have to have also in mind that investing in nature alone won't be enough. And that can help a lot, but it will not solve the problem. And then to secure a healthy and livable planet for everyone, the report indicates clearly that we need to transform our way of life fundamentally, especially key elements such as our industry, our energy systems, as well as how cities and infrastructure are planned and built. And then it's easy to say, and sometimes they said that it's difficult and then to bring it. But the experience we have, we live in with the COVID indicated us, if we are serious about it, and if we are aware about it, we can act faster than we thought. And those are some of the few elements I just want to highlight in addressing your question.
No, those are great responses, and that the role of science in the rapid response to COVID was really important. And there too, though, here and there was resistance that made and inequity. The vaccines didn't get everywhere they needed to go, and so that equity issue is there as well, even when science does its job. The one thing I think of often, I've written about this a few times, facing the flooding around the world that relates to the green infrastructure you're talking about, is the expression "build back spongier." In other words, if we can design with nature, with sort of flooding in mind, city landscapes don't have to be looking the way they are these days too often around the world. So thank you for that, those reflections. Barbara, carbon dioxide, CO2, the main heat-trapping greenhouse gas, once it gets emitted, it can stay in the atmosphere it stays in circulation for centuries, if not longer. And the climate system itself has momentum. Once these big glaciers start eroding, they don't just magically stop. That means we're committed, as the IPCC reports have said, to centuries of warming and to sea level rise. So these things can be mitigated for sure, and the risks of big outcomes, the big bad outcomes, can be mitigated. But we're committed to some level of climate change. How much climate change do we expect to have to adapt to? What do we do with that? How does the world respond with that commitment baked in, but with the need to also act now? Are we getting better? Sorry.
Are we getting better? No, well, a difficult question, and obviously there are a number of reputable science organizations, such obviously the most important one, the IPCC, who are tracking the trajectories of climate change impacts. And I think we also know that the Paris Agreement, which is this important international agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that global warming would not exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, is based on the IPCC's projections. But as we also know, that the most recent report actually revealed that at the moment we're not reducing these emissions fast enough to stay under the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. But we still have a fighting chance to stay under the 2 degrees Celsius if we transition aggressively over the next decade, basically of the rest of this decade, most importantly. But you asked what are we expecting to adapt to, and how much do we actually have to expect as a society, and whether we're getting better. Well, at 2 degrees Celsius of temperature change, what we would see are significantly more impacts than we are already experiencing today. And those are things like droughts, those are things like floods, wildfires, heat waves, sea level rises, but also the pandemics like we've had already, and food system disruptions, both on land and in oceans. And what we've heard more and more, with more and more information, more and more actual evidence is also summarized in a very interesting report by Swiss Re that recently estimated that on our current path, the impact of climate change could cost more than 10% of global GDP by 2050. And that in today's dollars is more than $5 trillion annually. And that does not yet account for all the human suffering that goes along with those impacts, such as famine and mass migration, which obviously are incalculable. So are we getting better at adaptation? Well, I am an optimist, so I will say yes, but I'm also a realist, so I will say yes and no, because what we see is that finance towards adaptation is increasing. My organization tracks these investments, and of the hundreds of billions a year globally currently claimed that climate action, we have seen actually an increasing part going towards financing adaptation, but at the same time, it still is only about 7% or less than $50 billion that currently go globally towards financing adaptation. That is far below the expected need of up to $300 billion annually by 2030. So we do need to expand adaptation investment significantly, and we do need to do this rapidly because, as know that these impacts will only get worse. So, small step in the right direction, but hopefully on the way to COP27 this year, there will be more activities and more clear announcements that will help us to increase the share of adaptation globally.
Yeah, as a journalist, I get tired of reporting each year about the adaptation gap report. I think it doesn't get enough attention, actually. The emissions gap report seems to make headlines, the adaptation gap, not so much. I wish the countries of the world would see this more as an investment than as spending. You're investing investing in resilience, investing in building resilience where it's most needed, where people are most vulnerable, where conflict and disruption can really kick back. So thanks again for these observations. Youba, what types of collaboration and cooperation are needed, both between governments and public and private sectors, to get beyond the latest climate pledges, which still leave a significant gap in the emissions side, the emissions reductions needed by 2050 to keep 1.5C within reach, to accelerate the journey to a sustainable future? Is there some particular model that you see as having the best prospect of breaking through some of the barriers?
I think that this is important, and one have to think of and then to have a much more holistic view and go beyond some of the aspects you just highlighted: funding, mitigation, adaptation, resilient creating. And as what our reports indicated clearly is that a worldwide action and then to achieve a climate resilient and sustainable world is more urgent than previously thought. But the question is that what can be done? And then we try to highlight some, to indicate some of those different options, and as a solution that can be called climate resilient development, and clearly the report of the working group too. It combines strategies to adapt to climate change with action to reduce greenhouse gases emission, and then to support sustainable development everywhere and for everyone. And action to implement this concept has started to a certain extent, has to start now, because making progress is already challenging at current global warming levels, as indicated by Barbara. And I think that one have to have in mind that the climate resilient development involves everyone. And then the prospect for that means all the different stakeholders. And then the prospect for effective action improve when governments at all levels, and then from the local to the regional and national, work with citizens. civil society, educational bodies and scientific institutions, the media, investor and business, and form partnership with traditionally marginalized groups, including women, youth, indigenous people, local communities, and ethnic minorities, because we have to bring all those together. It is not only a matter of government and the private sector. It requires everything, and then we need to get, all of us need to be mobilized at the equal foot. And that means the government has to change the way it works, the way it operates, the way it deals with those different communities. It's very important. And in such a societal setting, scientific, indigenous, and local knowledge and practices are very important, because all different forms of knowledge are very important. And then we have tendency only to rely on the scientific one and then neglecting the other one. And then this is, the government has a critical role and to bring those different aspects. In addition, the report indicated also that different interest values and worldviews can be reconciled if everyone works together. And then we have seen during the COVID again, a sense of great solidarity. You know, I was living in Geneva before moving back to Mali in Bamako. I was in Geneva. I have seen a great sense of solidarity in my neighborhood. For some people, I never had any contact, because we are all facing an urgent problem, urgent issue. This sense is very important. And targeting a climate resilient, sustainable world involves also a fundamental change to how societies functions, including changes in underlying values, the world views, ideology, social structure, and then political economy. And this may feel overwhelming at first, but the world is changing, and then anyway, and then it will continue to change. And then so that if we concentrate on, rather than making here mitigation or adaptation or funding some other aspect, if we concentrate on climate resilient development, and then that offer a way to drive change and to improve well-being for all. And at the end, this is what matters. And then we are at the stage that we really have to bring those different elements. I was just talking to African group of negotiators just before this dialogue, and I indicated, get out of the dichotomy of mitigation and adaptation. Concentrate on how to make development more sustainable and how to make it compatible with climate.
Oh boy, you're ringing my bell. I've been thinking along those lines for a long time, and it's great to hear that conversation is building around climate resilient development as the focal point. To me, after 35 years on the climate change beat, I think what we're seeking is a better relationship with the climate system between humans and climate that involves that holistic approach. So bravo to that. I might have to write something about that quite soon. So now we're going to a round two of questions, and we start again with Youba. Youba, the current UNGA president, Csaba Kőrösi, has pledged to focus on, quote, enhancing the role of science in decision-making. This is particularly relevant for climate change, as robust scientific data is needed to fully understand climate change and how effectively to respond to it. What are some good examples of government agencies or technology companies that are providing this robust scientific data that will drive decision-making, looking at both mitigating and adapting to climate change?
And this is a very important issue, and it started when we started discussing climate issues. What came to my mind is the whole process of IPCC. And then it's very important. When IPCC started in early 90s, end of 80s and early 90s, beginning, were very limited information, very limited scientific education on various aspects of climate, apart the physical science and some of the natural science. And when we started the assessment, some said that, oh, we may have deal with something like 10,000 publications. And actually, some are arguing that the publication on climate is more than 500,000 in a periodic cycle. And then that means it has stimulated, the process has stimulated the production of scientific knowledge. And then you cannot produce the scientific knowledge without having also the data and the information, and then the observation systems also that stimulate the development of all those. Is the process that has been put in place. And then that has also, if you look at even the scientific involvement and the scientific input on the finding of IPCCs was largely dominated by scientists coming from the north. We are seeing a lot of progress in other different regions. We have seen a lot of publication coming also for those regions. I remember my first days in IPCC back in the 90s, I said that what I'm doing here, because those people are talking about economics and physical science, while I'm much more interested on development issues, and then that did not at all echo. They said, oh, look, the point is that we are assessing the literature, we are not producing the literature. If you want that to be assessed, you have to produce. And then I and some of my fellow colleagues from Latin America and Asia, we get together, and then we made a number of publications on the peer-reviewed journals on the issues that are pertinent to our perspective. At the same time, we bring some of the elements because we know that data and information are lacking, and then to try to stimulate also those perspectives. And then the best experience I can indicate for that is IPCC, because IPCC is a non-organization because it has no legal status. Mm-hmm. And the process is an open process. No one is funded and then to work for IPCC on a voluntary basis. We create a platform and then that stimulate. Even for the 1.5, when we have been asked and then to produce a report on it, we said, oh, this is not possible because there's no publication. We are lacking data, information. And within 2 years, we assessed 60,000 papers on a number of issues, so that stimulate. And I think that those kind of process, we need to learn from it, and then how to translate that in the technology issues, technology transfer, technology cooperation issues, other are very needed. And those are some of the element I just want to put in front.
What you said about the physical sciences in contrast to the social sciences resonates. Last year, there was a paper published by Sovakul and Overland, where they described the research gap, that there's hardly any social science related to mitigation compared to physical science. Just an observation, I think that the social climate essentially is really what determines how we react or don't react to the science, the physical science. So you're really onto something important there. Barbara, climate change is obviously a complex issue with so many dimensions: science, economics, politics, moral and ethical questions. What can you say are some of the most successful policies and approaches that are driving mitigation action and ensuring safeguarding communities' economic well-being at the same time? We're seeing this challenge all around the world these days, with high energy prices getting in the way of climate progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a few that I'd love to share with you, but I just want to also kind of follow on from the previous discussion here around collaboration. I think for me, this is absolutely important, and it needs to go having a different type of process and really trying to see how you can, across the different approaches that I'm going to share here, but how can you really build the knowledge in a better way by really drawing on the lessons from a very, very broad kind of audience and different types of the overarching system. I think what you also said, Andrew, before, climate, basically, if I had to start an organization again, today I probably would not call it climate policy initiative, because ultimately I think climate needs to be mainstreamed everywhere. We shouldn't call it climate finance or climate this. I think it needs to be financed with having climate mainstreamed. And I think probably that's my first lesson, just like mainstreaming climate across the whole financial and economic system, energy system, I think is fundamental. But obviously some of the more concrete, I think, lessons and approaches that we see are working and are critical if you want to make more progress. Is first, commitments. I think what we see is that we need governments, we need investors, we need companies to set explicit and ambitious net zero sustainable targets, and that ideally by latest 2050, but with clear interim targets at 5-year intervals that can really allow us to see whether we are progressing fast enough. So first is around commitments. I think the second key component that I see is integrity. I think those commitments need to have integrity. So we talk about net zero, but the ultimate goal is true zero, or true sustainable net zero. I think every effort must be made to reduce emissions first, and components such as carbon offsets have a role to play, but they need to be only used where no mitigation options exist, and they need to be high quality and high integrity. And then the third one, I think, is something that came up already several times in this conversation here, which is transparency. And I think, Youba, I fully agree with you. Data and information is so critical here. And again, everyone, governments, investors, companies need to track and report on their emissions, on the impact of those emissions on economies and on communities and their exposure to climate risk, but also on their investments and where they actually do put the money across their operations. And here again, no one has to start from scratch. There are established reporting frameworks, both for the public and for the private sectors, and no one has to be perfect. We must build capacity across the world, but also across and within all layers of public and private institutions to really handle climate disclosures, just like we do now also with financial disclosures. And governments can obviously also start by establishing voluntary frameworks and conducting stress tests on banking and on other key industries, eventually moving to, hopefully relatively soon, to mandatory frameworks that align with each government's net zero goals. And then just maybe a couple of specific lessons and approaches that we've seen can really make an impact faster. I think one we don't talk enough sufficiently, in my opinion, is methane. And this, I think, we know that a huge immediate impact per dollar invested on reducing greenhouse gases is around methane. And so I really see that there's an opportunity for governments to enact legislation and mobilize private finance to control flaring, to prohibit venting, and to enact prompt capping of methane leaks. And the second concrete lesson I'd like to just mention before handing back to you, Andreas, subsidies. I think we must finally end direct and indirect subsidies to fossil fuel companies and for harmful agricultural practices, and channel those same resources to support renewable energy and sustainable agriculture in a more just way. And I think this is something we've been talking about for a very long time, but I do hope that this is something that finally will really translate into concrete action on the ground. So let me hand back to you.
Those are great points. On the point of transparency, one thing that encourages me greatly these days is the lowering cost of imposing transparency as a source of trust but verify. The past American president said that. When I was, in 1992, when I was working with the Environmental Defense Fund a little bit, writing a book about global warming, I never would have imagined they would launch a satellite. Methane satellite, but EDF is launching its own satellite to track methane emissions. Deforestation is tracked almost hourly now by satellites and other means. So we're in a world where clarity is there if we want to look for it. And companies that want to step forward to get ahead of that are the wise ones. Let's put it that way. And that gets to this next question for Youba, which is about ESG. There's various acronyms have been applied to trustworthy company behavior for sustainability. ESG investing or sustainable investing is considered by some to be a big part of how we can mitigate climate change and the warming rate. And do you agree? And if so, how can we encourage more companies to adopt effective ESG policies to accelerate climate action?
I think, as it has been outlined by many scientific findings and any different forum of discussions, the real issue is that the radical change of the way we are doing business, we are operating, because sectoral and changes will not solve the problem. Piecemeal approach will not change the nature of the problem. It's much more profound that taking any company and then to say that to look at the environmental aspect of the company, and then to look at the social responsibility of the company and the governance. And then we have to go beyond we have to go beyond the sector, as we have to go beyond a single country or group of countries, because an holistic approach is much more needed. I do agree with what they are doing, but that will not solve the problem at the stage we are. It should have started 30 years ago, but that will not, and then fundamentally, and then we have to tackle and then to go beyond the approach that is taken without undermining such kind of effort, without also undermining the need to push further and then to bring different set of company on board. What kind of projects we are having, and how long those projects will last, and then how we change also the behavior of the consumer, because all those different elements are interrelated. And this is some of the few elements I just want to offer on this very important issue.
That's a great intervention, and thank you again. The leadership question keeps coming up too. In the conversation with Barbara a minute ago, the idea of moral and ethical leadership at companies can really make a difference. It's not just in the numbers. Barbara, so what are some valuable lessons learned so far, that climate-minded businesses, cities, communities, or countries can build on as they implement mitigation and adaptation measures? Are there some case studies that stand out, or key ideas?
Yeah, well, there's lots of case studies. I think one of the issues is actually we got to find the real key lessons that can help us. But I think for me, there's like 3 areas of lessons that could help, again, accelerate some of the progress. I think the first is really kind of to realize urgency. We are now seeing the very negative impact of our inability to act across, economies, across different types of stakeholders. So the investment needed now is much higher than if we had started in earnest 20 years ago. So every year of delay increases the cost exponentially. So first lesson is really kind of realize the urgency that are out there. But that brings me to my second lesson. It's something I've already said before, because I really truly believe in it, and that is opportunity. I think we need to change the narrative from, this is a cost, this is a risk, this is a danger, to this is a real opportunity. I think the opportunities of transitioning to more sustainable economies far outweigh the risks, and business as usual will only get increasingly risky, but this is a real opportunity again. And those who are showing leadership will really see the rewards in it. And I think we already see in today's economies that there are, the ones who have started act early actually are being rewarded. So second lesson, I think, is opportunity. And then I think the third one, and I think has come out also in several of the points that you guys mentioned, is equity. I think those opportunities will not be evenly distributed unless we pay very close attention to what is now being called a just transition. So as we invest in these transitions, we must account for the impacts to workers, to families, to communities, to governments, and ensure transition investments that really address those socioeconomic imbalances so that everyone benefits. So I think the 3 lessons for me are really kind of urgency, opportunity, and equity. But again, I am an optimist, otherwise I wouldn't be working still in this area. So I truly believe that this is something that really could make a change to every investor, to every public and private stakeholder. So hopefully this is something that they will realize.
Those are great points, and hopefully they'll resonate through this coming year. Of course, we're heading into not just the General Assembly, but the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh is just around the corner. Adaptation, mitigation, and justice are all big discussion topics, including energy justice for countries in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly. What are your thoughts, both of you, and maybe we'll start with Barbara, on how we bridge the gap between mitigation, adaptation, and more generally, how do you think we can increase finance flows into adaptation action and for the agreed climate goals? We've kind of gone through this a little bit, but maybe as a summing statement, if there's some key shift that can happen to make COP27 stand out on this long journey we've had, all of us.
Well, and again, we've talked about that already a little bit. So for me, the key ways of increasing adaptation finance, ultimately it is policies that lead the way. So we need to make sure that there are strong targets, that there is strong enabling environment from governments that really, set incentives for investments to go into adaptation areas. And in this context, obviously, adaptation is a harder, it's more challenging sector. So we need to make sure that we use public finance most effectively to really focus on the harder sectors. Adaptation is a key one here, and really come up with more innovative financing approaches that can also unlock private investment, because ultimately we will not be able to address the current financing gap that we have if we really want to get on this 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway without unlocking the trillions that are under management by the private financial institutions. So we need to come up with more innovative financial instruments. There's a lot of work already going on. There is an array of financial instruments that can be used to increase investment in adaptation, from different parts of the overarching ecosystem, from insurance to, liquidity support, to debt relief, to specific public-private partnerships or other blended finance mechanisms. But ultimately, really what I feel is needed is just more innovation in coming up with the right financial instruments that use public money more effectively to unlock private capital and really make it go towards adaptation, while also making sure that there is a level playing field and that the right policies are in place. So maybe let me just keep it with these two overarching points.
Youba, you had mentioned this shift in thinking about this challenge toward climate resilient development, which to me feels like it really can create a different sense for investors, for governments, of the broad benefits of investment here. Is that a key to the path forward here, to truly put the sustainable development question in the foreground?
I think that context matters, and timing is crucial. And in that regard, and I think that the risk posed by climate change vary by location, time, and then among different populations, even within the same country. And that means each community and each nation has its own starting point. And for climate adaptation, for mitigation, or an added element that is not in the literature, that is avoided emissions. Because in the African case, the issue is really to avoid emission, because bringing adaptation mitigation, not bringing the avoided emission. That means you will reward those who are polluting. But to avoid emission, that means to take another path on that, and sustainable development, and then to bring those different elements together. From anywhere we are starting, and which other pathway is followed, climate resilient development will only be possible if with a fundamental changes in 5 main areas as indicated in the IPCC 1.5 report and repeated in the 6th assessment report of the 3 working groups. Starting with our world energy system. We need to change completely our energy system and then to move away from supply-oriented to much more demand-oriented system. The second is the way we manage, we safeguard land and fresh water at the ocean and their respective ecosystems. And the third area, in the way cities and infrastructure are planned, built, organized, and governed. And the fourth area is in the way our economy and industry function. And the last one is in the way our society function on a local, national, and international level. And then all those to bring together, we have to face the tension, and that is the need for immediate action and the long-term perspective, and then the immediate needs of the people, and then the long-term perspective, how we invest at the two at the same time. And then this is the most challenging thing we are facing. And then to break the silos between mitigation, adaptation, finance, and then bringing those holistic approach is quite challenging. And then that means, and then to think at the same time, immediate short-term issues and the long-term perspective. Thank you.
Very well summarized. Yeah, that issue of urgency and patience are 2 words that come to mind for me when thinking about this. How do you reconcile having those words in your head and the imbalances, as we say here, you know, trying to rebalance things so that the pockets of vulnerability, pockets of energy opportunity are addressed, and that the developing countries and populations have the capacity to access the insights that science provides and the resources. In the United States, there's lots of new resources because of this climate bill that got passed, but communities without capacity can't necessarily even pursue them. Lots of work to be done. This has been an incredibly valuable discussion. Hopefully it will resonate far through the months ahead. Before we wrap up, I would like to ask you, see if you could share in 1 word how you describe the future of sustainability. You know, what's the word that sits in your head when you think about this? That's probably a tough assignment, but maybe Barbara first. Is there a word that comes to mind?
Several words, but I'd say inevitable. Future. Even though my second one would be inspiring, so I'm still kind of a little bit.
I know that's a tough assignment. And for you, Youba Sokona.
Solidarity.
That's a really good one. Inevitability, solidarity, and journey. I guess journey would be a word I would put in here too. We think sometimes of these things as having a neat and clean ending. You know, hurrah, we've solved the problem. This is a journey we're on through a century of momentous change and opportunity. Thanks to all the viewers who've tuned in here. If you want to watch the entire session, it will be posted on the Zayed Sustainability Prize's YouTube channel. And of course, share this information with others who can watch it there as well. Thanks particularly to Dr. Barbara Buchner, Global Managing Director of the Climate Policy Initiative, and Professor Youba Sokona, Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Both of you are on this journey for a long time. Group hug is appropriate for anyone. Keep up the good work, and let's keep on the journey.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.